I think there's no doubt that AI is the most important technology of our times. There are lots of different estimates, but I think most people would agree that we're talking about something like 8 to 10% of GDP, which is massive. That's like bigger than the internet, probably. This is kind of industrial revolution size technology.
Welcome to the inaugural Google AI Policy Brew. Today I have with me Jonathan Dupont from Public First, the author of the newly released Public Sector AI Adoption Index. Looking forward to a very insightful conversation on how AI is impacting our world, particularly in public services. So Jonathan, what are we drinking here today?
We are drinking Copio with ice. So starting a nice day with a nice coffee, get going.
So Jonathan, look, I travel around the region a good bit, and everywhere I go, governments are thinking about how to harness AI to boost their economies.
Yeah.
And when you think about boosting the economies, like just help us kind of scale this, right? At a high level, big picture, what's the economic value that we're looking at here?
I think there's no doubt that AI is the most important technology of our times. There are lots of different estimates, but I think most people would agree that we're talking about something like 8 to 10% of GDP, which is massive. That's like bigger than the internet, probably. This is kind of industrial revolution size technology. And what I think is really interesting about that is when you do the same kind of models, often you would used to see like, we have this great private sector technology, but it doesn't help government too much.
Sure.
But here, that's not the case. When we actually model it, we see that we have just as much benefit in the public sector and the private sector. One estimate of that, I think BCG put out last year, is that is a 1.75 trillion in potential value for public sector.
Wow.
By 2033. Across the world, you kind of see governments fall into one of two camps. So you see kind of maybe governments in the global south or kind of more emerging economy. AI can really help do that, can really help spread resources and boost access there. And then you see advanced economies, but they're often struggling just as much too because they have an aging population, they have all these demographic pressures. And again, they're all struggling to kind of boost public sector productivity. I think AI can really help in all these places, which is why everywhere you look, governments are obsessed with how can we use AI. And then beyond just the pure monetary, help you do public service in a different way, right? It can just help us have a better, more flexible public service.
Well, look, sounds like there's opportunities and challenges across the board. We know from industry data that 96% of governments have an AI plan, but it's a big difference between having a strategy that sits on a desk and putting it into practice. What are you seeing in terms of the implementation gaps?
We surveyed in over 10 countries, in total about 3,300 people who work in government, and asked them what actually was happening on the ground, how they were using AI, kind of how it was working, why they started to use it. Governments around the world are trying to do AI, but there is not that much hard data on what is actually happening so far, and we want to slightly close the gap. There was one EY survey that came out last year, which showed that they might have these plans, but it was not very much that was actually happening in practice. There was about a 26% which were actually implementing it. So we really wanted to kind of dig beneath that. How are people actually using AI in practice? And we basically came up with these 5 different scores, the 5 E's, how enthusiastic people were in government.
Enthusiasm, okay.
Yeah, it's always important. You got to be passionate about what you're doing.
Yep.
How empowered that people felt. So that was where the kind of countries were setting those clear strategies. Enabled, which was kind of whether they actually had access to tools that they could use. Embedded, which was whether those tools kind of actually went into workflows. Like it wasn't just a chatbot, but it was actually part of your day-to-day work. And then finally, we looked at education and skills, like whether people had the support they needed to get going and actually use AI properly.
With those indicators, I think it gives us and governments a good roadmap. If you look at the APAC region, where are governments succeeding against those 5 indicators, and where do you see some critical bottlenecks occurring?
The first thing to say is that what definitely isn't much of a bottleneck in most places is enthusiasm. We saw kind of enthusiasm is relatively high everywhere. And we saw in our survey actually about 74% of people said they'd actually were already using AI. A lot of those had just started in the last year. What was often more of a bottleneck is you have this enthusiasm, but they don't necessarily have the enablement about how it actually fits into kind of their day-to-day at work. So we want to really transform how public sector works long term. We need to kind of move beyond this shadow IT kind of shadow AI usage to actually having AI be part of the proper workflows in kind of a secure fashion.
Yeah, that says a couple of things to me. One, that the workforce and citizens are eager, they're hungry, they're excited, the enthusiasm is there, but the institutional systems may be lagging behind. But also, I think it's an interesting phenomenon where people are essentially hiding and using the tools behind the scenes as opposed to coming above the line and truly implementing AI technology. This shadow AI phenomenon is probably one of the things that keeps government IT directors up at night. So at Google, one of the things that we've been saying is governments that really want to drive adoption really have to get the right organizational structure. And we've been trying to be a partner to government in that way. It's great to have an AI model like Gemini. That's great. But you need to go beyond that. You also need to make sure that you have secure by design cloud environments. Tools like Google's Vertex AI, trusted data sources. So these are things that we've been working on with governments, things like our secure AI framework to ensure that the right infrastructure and organizational structure is in place to actually drive adoption. How is that playing out in the research that you've seen?
We do see actually that, the shadow AI is a serious issue, that like, particularly enthusiastic users. So the people who want to use these tools, I think it was 70% of them said that they were kind of using AI without telling their manager.
70%.
64% you were just using their own login, so their own Gemini account, their own ChatGPT. They were just kind of logging in without telling someone. And obviously, that's not great.
It creates its own security issues, right?
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with some of the most kind of sensitive and kind of confidential data.
Let's look at APAC specifically, the markets in the region. How are our markets here in the Asia Pacific ranking in your index?
We looked at Singapore, India, and Japan. Both Singapore and India did really well, but for kind of very different reasons, I would say. So India, I said, we really saw kind of this enthusiastic kind of user base that really wanted to take up and learn and use these AI tools. And Singapore was slightly less enthusiastic, but had much of a kind of a national kind of strategy, kind of had really good, clear kind of empowerment of people to do what they were doing. The country that lagged behind slightly was Japan, where we just saw slightly less enthusiasm and kind of adoption of these tools.
Being in India for the AI summit, you saw the grassroots momentum, the energy, the enthusiasm. I think the Indian government is doing great work in trying to drive AI adoption at scale, and that was on full display at the AI Impact Summit. In Japan, very interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Japan has really been a leader in terms of thinking about the regulatory frameworks around AI. So as you know, Japan passed the AI Promotion Act, which has done a lot of work in terms of creating the right regulatory environment for promoting the adoption of AI, promoting innovation. We've actually held the Japan AI Promotion Act up as a lighthouse for governments around the world that are thinking about how to create the right regulatory framework for this. So I thought it was very interesting that Japan was in the category of cautious adopter in your index. Can you say more about that seemingly paradox there?
Where we just looked at kind of AI adoption in general and kind of how that varied across countries, the general population. And one of the things we know about that is that it's very tied to GDP per capita, that kind of advanced economies normally have higher AI adoption. But what's really interesting is when you look at countries that go off that trend, so have either higher or lower adoption than you might expect for kind of their low overall level of development. And so both Singapore and is hugely above trend. Like Singapore, it always comes off as like a big AI leader. So we expect that to be the top. India, again, is above trend. But Japan does actually lag a little bit behind on kind of those measures. Adoption is a little bit slower than you might think. That might just be, we often see adoption is slightly higher, quicker in kind of more English-speaking countries, just because that's where the tools came out first.
Like Singapore and India.
Yeah, exactly.
Your fifth indicator was education and skills. How does the data link education and skilling to the adoption rates?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting because there is an argument that why do you need education to learn how to use AI? You can just talk to it, right? And it changes every 5 seconds. If you ask it what prompt should I use, it'll tell you. But actually, we find that's not the case in our data. Education and training does make a difference. So I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So one, you just need to know how to use AI in your particular environment. Like, how do I bed into my work systems? But more fundamentally, it's just about confidence, particularly for people who are kind of less natural tech adopters. Giving people a chance to taste these kind of tools and kind of get experience with them can massively raise confidence. And it doesn't have to be a lot. So we did another study in the UK where we tried testing training with teachers, say, and we found like only a couple of hours of training would kind of double usage like 3 months later. It's just really giving people that first taste. And in our data here, again, we were seeing that kind of people who had training, they could kind of double confidence for people who have worked in public sector a long time. So this stuff can have a big impact. I think particularly in these first few years, as we're trying to get people on board, get them used and comfortable and fluent with these tools, that it's worth putting in kind of these short training courses. They don't need to be like 6 months going to a mini masters or something. They just need to get you used to playing with the tools.
Well, it's great to hear that came out in your research because that's very consistent with how we see it as well at Google. We think when you have that kind of uplift in education and skilling, it creates this halo effect. It allows people to trust the technology more and by extension, adopt the technology more. How are you seeing this play out in the everyday lives of citizens? How is this helping people every day?
So I think it just helps people help with kind of the administrative parts of their job, the routine stuff, like that could be helping you do research, help you edit kind of text, and lets you spend more time on the things that only kind of a human can do. Like if you're a doctor, they can help you with your admin. You have more time to talk to patients. I think it's not, in many professions, kind of replacing the core part of the job. It's kind of acting as an assistant and augmenting people as they get stuff done.
For me, the adoption of this technology, very interesting, and it's going to raise productivity. It's going to help us unlock that $1.75 trillion potential that you mentioned earlier, but it's having a meaningful impact on people's lives and livelihood. So Jonathan, as we finish our Kopi iced coffee, cheers. If you were to give governments one piece of advice in terms of next steps in driving AI adoption, what would your advice be?
Every government starts from a slightly different place. So I think we're all trying to get to that place where we have linked up, joined, secure data and that kind of beds our AI tools. That doesn't mean there aren't things we could do while we're working on that. So the advice I would give every government, basically, is giving a clearer steer to the people of what they should be doing today, giving people kind of this safe harbor of these are kind of the low risk kind of tools and workflows that you can use AI tools for today that will help you in your job and kind of start unlocking those benefits.
So look, in the tech policy space, when we use the term safe harbor, that usually relates to intermediary liability and those types of issues. But in this context, in your report, when you say safe harbor, what do you mean by that specifically?
Yeah, so we often just see a lot of anxiety. People just aren't sure what they can and can't do with AI. And they say, because I don't want to leak a member of the public's kind of often very private data. So I think it's just giving really clear recommendations of these are things that you're allowed to do. These are safe. These are where we can really unlock benefits, and giving people kind of that room for experimentation and kind of a test bed to kind of start playing with AI and see what it can do for them.
Yeah, very, very clear. So safe harbor, permission to use the technology in low risk use cases.
A few clear use cases, maybe some exemplary activities, like there are 1 to 2, 3 things you can do today that will really start helping things out.
And having the right organizational structure. So look, Jonathan Dupont from Public First, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Very good advice for governments as they continue to drive AI adoption.
Thank you very much for having me.